Now that we've worked through the guiding concepts of cultural inclusivity and discussed tools that can help us improve cultural inclusivity, we're going to use this knowledge to identify and navigate cultural differences in the field. How we use these tools and knowledge will depend on who we're interacting with and engaging with, whether it is our team or individuals external to our team. When we're engaging and interacting with members of our own field team, we have established expectations regarding acceptable and unacceptable behaviors and norms that we, as a team, are bound by through plans such as the Code of Conduct. On the other hand, when we engage with external groups, there is an acknowledgement that we as a team or as individuals cannot always control or set expectations within external groups or communities. Sometimes we may be able to develop a joint code of conduct or other mechanisms, but that is not always possible. However, we can prepare ahead of time by being aware of cultural differences that may exist and develop strategies that we can use in potentially difficult times. We will explore several experiences from our voices to explore how to identify and navigate in-team and external cultural differences.
In a field environment, you can have cultural differences between institutes, between different nationalities, and often you're all in the same working space. And then what often makes it more challenging is you're often in the same living space as well. And sometimes that living space is tight. And I've found over the years that sort of the big unifying thing that everybody does is they have to get around and eat, right, at some point. And so thinking about food is kind of important. So it's like, what are the things that you can do to build bridges with other groups and other teams in terms of either cooking together, cooking for each other, thinking about how you do that. I've seen field teams in shared accommodation space where they've come in and there's been 8 team members and they've cooked 8 different ramen noodle dinners and gone away and eaten them in their rooms. And then I've seen that same team 2 or 3 years later cooking food together happily as a group or rotating cooking duties. And all of that stuff is just, it's key. It's that sort of downtime where you get to sort of talk a little bit about your science, a little bit about where people have come from and what they're trying to do. And to me, it's a really useful way of doing better science in a place as well, because you learn really important things in those sort of social situations. So I think that's one of the most effective ways I've found of getting to understand other groups and breaking down some of those barriers.
Alastair's example highlights the role of shared routines like preparing meals in building awareness and inclusive practices over time. By cooking and socializing together, the team moved from isolated habits amongst colleagues to shared experience with friends, demonstrating how everyday actions can foster deeper understanding and cultural connection. Now let's hear from Sophia.
So one component of the field safety handbook that our research group used, one of these intentional components was a section on cultural differences. We also were primarily staying at a research station in northern Sweden that hosted people from all over Europe, not only Sweden, all over Europe and North America. And so it's kind of, preparing individuals for this international experience, I think was really important. A specific example was that we each field season, we discussed that there are several saunas located at this research station. And culturally in Sweden, people often choose to sauna in the nude with mostly with towels, sometimes not. And so these types of situations can make people uncomfortable if they're not aware of that being an option. And so we discussed that in our pre-departure meetings that saunaing is a common practice. Decisions can be made on where and when you sauna and who you sauna with, and there's sign out procedures for signing out saunas and things like that. So sort of just discussing that ahead of time, I think is a good way to make people aware of these cultural differences without it being a shock to the system that can be hard hard to manage when you're already in an unfamiliar environment.
Sophia's story shows how proactive learning and preparation can ease cultural tensions in unfamiliar environments. By integrating cultural awareness into team planning, her group modeled how to anticipate differences and implement inclusive, respectful practices before entering the field. Our next voice from the field shares an example of an international Arctic research expedition.
Navigating cultural differences in fieldwork is such a challenging area, in particular because so often, especially for Arctic research, it's an international venue, right? The Arctic spans many nations and lots of different people are involved in that kind of research. And so for our Mosaic expedition, we had people from 37 different nations there. So naturally, lots of different perspectives brought into this very, close environment where we had to work intimately together. And, there's a great example of a kind of a major cultural difference. And that was during the install time period, we actually had the support of a Russian vessel to help put out a lot of our equipment. This was a Russian vessel, and they lived by Russian cultural norms. There were a lot of American and European people, scientists on board that vessel doing their work. And there became this conflict whereby, especially a lot of the women involved, would wear clothing that from the Russian perspective was provocative, although from the American and European perspective was normal and accepted, right? So there was this norm. Or another part of the puzzle there was that the Russian sailors didn't really allow young women scientists to carry their own heavy equipment, right? It was these big burly sailor men that needed to carry the equipment. In the end, I'm not sure if we actually did resolve anything with that, but it's important, I think, for all of us to recognize the important role of the cultural differences, right? Neither side was right or wrong in this case, right? There are just different expectations and norms. And I think that the big thing we did learn about it is that, one, we need to learn how to communicate better. What are the expectations? And let's make sure that we're clear on that, right? So, of course, a Russian ship has every right to set the expectations for what happens on the ship, but let's make sure that's communicated so that the participants there know that ahead of time and can know what they're getting into, right? So the communication part is really essential when we're dealing with these cultural differences. And the second part is, let's be sensitive to each other, right? Let's be sensitive to those cultural differences. We understand that we live by a certain set of norms and others live by a different one. And if we can find ways to respect those others while also respecting ourselves, well, that's a win for everybody, right? So increased sensitivity for those cultural differences is really important in these kinds of environments so that we can arrive at an environment that's actually supportive of everybody involved.
Matt's experience reveals the need for humility and clear communication when navigating contrasting cultural norms. Recognizing that no single set of expectations is universally correct, his team emphasized mutual sensitivity and the importance of setting shared understandings early on. In our next example, we hear from Wendy and her experience as an Indigenous woman on a field campaign.
Looking at the differences in our cultural worldviews and identities in field work, as an oceanographer, going out to sea the first time, I went out as an Indigenous woman. I'm always, my cultural responsibility is first and foremost in the work that I do. But on that research vessel, everyone was from, different backgrounds. We have science crew, we have the ship crew, we have the technology crew. And we were out there sampling and discovered that the ship had been dumping garbage over the side. And we found some of the Dole pineapple cans on our research site. And this was off the coast of Hawaii. And one of the crew members found out and ended up asking the research crew to have a discussion about respecting space and respecting what they were putting into the ocean, because that is their traditional space and lands and waterways which they live on. That's their food resources come from that water. So not only was it impacting our science research by contaminating our sites, but more importantly, it was impacting the traditional lands of the Hawaiian people. And so that conversation, I think, was eye-opening for the research team. And then acknowledging that everywhere we go, we have cultural differences between disciplines and subdisciplines, but also wherever we work, there are unique protocols and practices. And whether we know they're there or not, they exist. And it's part of our responsibility as scientists to know where we're working and to know the protocols and practices of that space and to respect that.
Wendy's reflection demonstrates how self-reflection and humility are critical in respecting local cultural protocols. It also highlights the importance of learning and pre-field research to understanding Indigenous cultural environmental practices and ethics related to land stewardship. Her story reminds us that field work takes place within living cultural landscapes, and honoring those spaces requires cultural awareness, engagement, and respect for traditional lands that we are working on as scientists. Now let's hear from Kay's experience navigating cultural differences during fieldwork.
So one experience I had identifying and navigating a cultural difference when I was doing fieldwork is some of the fieldwork I have done was on South African ships where there are a much larger number of Muslim scientists, technicians than I typically interact with in my day-to-day life. And specifically, these fieldwork were happened during Ramadan. And so this was something that came up a lot as people were fasting during the day and doing other practices related to Ramadan. And it was something that I didn't know a lot about. And so just talking to people and learning about their practices and about what would be best for them as they did field work while fasting was something that was really helpful. And in the end, I think I learned a lot, and these were lessons that I could apply to other parts of my life. And so for me, at least, it was a really positive experience in a way that I met people that I maybe wouldn't typically meet, people who were celebrating Ramadan.
Kay's story illustrates how cultural inclusivity grows through personal learning and daily practice. For example, adapting to unfamiliar religious customs. Kay's approach reinforces the value of listening, openness, and living authentically. Now let's hear again from Alistair and his reflection that emphasizes the importance of humility and flexibility when working across different organizational and national cultures.
One of the things that's challenging with sort of bridging these cultural divides is groups can have different expectations of things, and this could be different institutes or different nationalities. So a classic one is, what time's an okay time to head out to the field? And that can be wildly different for different groups depending on what their science goals are, but also their nationalities. And what I've found is that sometimes you just have to accept that there's going to be some scientific compromise in the short term to enable you to just relax and just roll with the schedule of whoever's, either the logistics provider or if it's the group that you're working with in the field, because they often have to deal and juggle with lots of other things that you're completely unaware of. And so just having some patience and flexibility with those groups that you're working with, I think is really important. And they appreciate that as well.
Alistair shared that recognizing and accepting variation in team norms, even when it requires compromise, is a powerful practice in building inclusive and respectful field teams. He highlights how cultural variables are a factor and sometimes a limitation to consider in field planning, just like weather and logistics. These are realistic constraints for individuals in field campaigns, and they warrant priority to anticipate and plan for, and flexibility while you're in the field to keep your field team cohesive and productive.
We have presented a few experiences to help you identify and navigate cultural differences within the field. It is important to highlight that these are just a few examples and that cultural differences can present themselves in a wide variety of ways in the field, and it requires time and effort to build a better skill set for identifying and navigating them on your own.